morning, folks. So, we are gathered here today for a very special discussion with a very special guest who is coming back to continue our conversation from a previous episode. But before we get started, let me give you a disclaimer because some of the things that may be discussed on this podcast may include trauma of all sorts, to include all types of abuse. Viewers and listeners may find it unsettling and triggering. The guests on our live streams reflect a diverse set of values, morals, and ethics that may not reflect the morals, values, and ethics of the Misfit Amish. If this live stream causes you distress, please seek support from your trusted folks and qualified mental health professionals as needed. Also, please stop listening until you are in a better place and space and able to listen again. With that being said, welcome to this episode of Coffee with Rhoda. Good morning, Rhoda.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
I am doing really well. I've been so excited for this. It's been like the highlight of my week. I've kind of had a rough week, but I've been so excited for this. I think I'm hearing a little echo,
Oh my.
but maybe not. Not enough to be worried about.
Well, I'm not hearing an echo unless I talk and you're not muted. So that like causes anyways. But regardless, technology, right? Isn't it a wonderful thing because we get to have coffee together and we're like across the country from each other. Like we're not even close to each other. But regardless, sorry you had a rough week. Sometimes that does happen and it can be a lot to deal with. Like just yeah. So I've been looking forward to this coffee because I want to ask Rhoda what Mennonite dating customs she's used to. I just really want to, I have to get that out of the way. I have to know because I'm nosy.
Okay, so the biggest Mennonite dating custom that comes to mind that I think is across the board for plain Mennonites, I have not heard much variation of this, is well, there's kind of two that go together. For it to be official, the guy has to ask the girl's father before they begin dating. Now, my understanding is that in mainstream American culture, that conversation sometimes happens before engagement, but for Mennonite couples, that happens before they begin dating. There is some variation in how that happens, though, how that conversation goes. So, some circles of Mennonites, the dude will go to his dad or his pastors, his ministers. Ministers is the correct term. And then those ministers will go to the girls' ministry and they will discuss whether the spiritual health of these two are compatible, if both are mature enough for marriage or should seriously consider marriage. And then they will have a conversation with the girl's dad. And then the girl's dad will have a conversation with the girl. And so by the time they go on their first date, all of these men in positions of power already know of his interest in her. And I say his interest in her because as a female raised in conservative Mennonite circles, the push was not so much for there to be a shared interest, but for there to be a shared agreement that this was God's will. So a girl could turn down a guy for no reason other than I felt like God wanted me to say no. Um, so that's the official way to go about dating. That said, if it sounds complicated and fraught with potential for misunderstanding and ill will, it's because it is. So there's this other thing called barnyard dating, which or backyard dating. I've heard both. The implication of that is that these young people have an interest in each other. They're less concerned about checking off the religious expectation boxes, and they're more concerned just with spending time with each other because they love being together. And so they hang out informally, but they spend so much time together that it would be considered excessive for a friendship. And even friendships between opposite genders are I'm sorry.
I didn't say anything. It's just my face saying things. I'm sorry.
Uh, so even friendships between opposite gender people are frowned upon, and so they kind of have this informal thing going on. And from there, once that relationship has solidified and they are certain that they want to move forward, then they'll go through the other processes. I have a really unpleasant memory, sort of, from my childhood that I was too young to understand all of the dynamics perfectly, but it was well known in our church that these teenagers had an interest in each other and that they'd had an interest in each other from when they were rather young. And so, what the ministry would do, in order to have a justification for saying that you're not ready to date yet, they needed some reason for that. They couldn't just like say that because that would look like ill will. So they would put him on proving for 6 months, and then at the end of the 6 months, release him from proving. And my memory, like I think they went back and forth between the two of them. Hold on, I have a visitor. Hey. I was gonna play some games. But I can play games unless you can touch your iPad. Can you ask Clark if he can switch with you? Yeah? Did, and he hasn't switched. I'm sorry, it's a big disappointment. No, my computer's not really working very well right now. I can't, and you just enter your password. No. Um, but they kind of ping ponged back and forth between which person they kept on proving. Is my like I was very young when this was going down. Like I would say I was probably under the age of 10. And so finally these two people both moved out of state as singles to a church that did not put them through that process, and they ended up getting married and they have a beautiful family now. And it was because this whole thing of courtship or dating, they prefer the term courtship because I guess it sounds holier. I'm not sure. Um, but this thing of dating based on interest, primarily interest, rather than based on, a process of fasting and praying and God telling you, um, it seemed unusual, I guess, to the leadership there, and so they tried to squelch it. Now, I would love to ask those people how accurately my childhood mind interpreted what was going on, but yeah, that's Mennonite dating.
I'm I'm sorry. Like I'm sorry. What? Like just like I'm sorry. Like I can't even. Like first off, I mean like you're you're talking about like one you're having this like where it's it's based on interest, but it's also like so worldly and like it's also like so vastly different, Rhoda. And we have a slight technical issue that I have to report on, so let me get back to that in a second. If you're trying to watch this broadcast on Facebook, um, it has not been streaming to Facebook. And I'm about to post a link for people, and I will upload the video later for all of you who wish to listen or watch on Facebook. Regardless, at the end of the day, what you're talking about is like you're talking about like this perception from a very young age, like this is how it is. And not only like does like do you have to have this interest, but like the ministry has to approve both his ministry, your ministry, and then your parents. Like, where's your bodily autonomy and freedom to make decisions? Um, isn't that's like a human right? You know that, right? Like it's a human right to be able to marry freely. So, would you do you feel like that violates that right?
Well, I would say that it's definitely more in keeping with cult like behavior to have that level of control over someone's life. Because really and truly, your significant other, that decision is a decision that impacts your faith for the rest of your life, your finances. It impacts most likely how far you will go in your career, depending if there's, I mean, you can't just make career choices based on yourself. You have to consider the other person and their career. Um, and so I think that does give a lot of power to people who really have no business holding that much power. Now, I say that, but I also need to clarify that not everyone involved in these decisions is power hungry. And so there are stories of daughters and dads having the conversation, and the daughter just tells the dad straight up, like, I don't like the dude. And the dad takes that into consideration and considers that reason enough to say no. So there are definitely stories of there being more concern for the woman's voice in that. But still, the way it's set up, if you are considered a nobody in the church, maybe because you are poor or your family is poor or your parents, in the last 2 decades have been on church discipline for God knows why. If there's any of that going on, then you end up being paired or not paired with people. And I really think they wouldn't say that it comes down to social standing, but it kind of does. Like it's the church leaders' kids and those who are close friends of the church leaders' kids are more likely to form marriages. But then the people who are on the outskirts of the community, those are left for each other. And so if there's an interest between a preacher's kid and someone who's on the outskirts of the community, that is not as likely to happen. Is, yeah.
Yeah. So, let me ask you this, like what would happen if a girl inadvertently is pregnant and is not married? Hypothetically.
Hypothetically speaking, I'm aware of elopements. I'm not sure that that was due to pregnancy or if it was just because the barnyard dating got pretty intense and they felt like there's no way they're going to wait for all of the approvals to come through. Plus, after you get approval, then you have to date typically no less than 6 to 8 months before you may get engaged. And after that, of course, then you still have some more months to plan the wedding. And so, if they felt like the attraction was too intense and they really wanted to not have sex until after they were married, but things were progressing rather quickly, I don't know what the reason is behind all of the elopements, but I would guess that that's the first step. I am aware of one girl who was pregnant out of wedlock, and she they ended up not marrying. Um, she had the baby, and they ended up needing to change communities because the community she had the baby in, like 2 or 3 years after the baby was born, um, the community was still like holding it over her, and she was a minor.
Oh my
I
goodness.
don't really think it's appropriate for me to say much more than that because people who know me can fairly quickly figure out who it was. The community that she went to then was much more accepting and welcoming of her. Um,
Yeah. But what I'm hearing, just to be clear, what I'm hearing is that somebody who became pregnant out of wedlock, what you observed is that they lost social status and they um, had to move to a new community and they had to like seek like support outside of that community. They literally had to go find a different environment because of the loss of social status inside of the community where this transpired. Now,
yes.
what about the person who engaged in impregnating this person?
They were sent to a different community as well, and there were factors involved that these individuals could not legally marry. Um, I'm not sure how much I want to say
Don't
on
don't.
there, but
Okay.
yeah, it like marriage was not an option. I have no doubt that if marriage was an option, they would most likely have been practically forced to marry. Um, I have not heard of Mennonite girls openly admitting to abortions. However, I have heard repeatedly of um, people talking about like people who live or work near abortion clinics saying that they do see Mennonite girls go into abortion clinics. And so that in like I'm not going to be naive enough to say that it doesn't happen in the Mennonites, even though it's more believable for me to say that I don't believe Mennonite girls who experience abortions or have abortions or are forced to have abortions. It's much more believable for me to say that they are not comfortable discussing their abortion experiences than it is to say that they don't discuss them because they don't have them. I do think abortion happens in Mennonite circles um, with young girls. I do think so.
Can I ask you this? Are you aware that when I shared my own personal experience last July when Roe versus Wade was overturned with abortion, are you aware that there were multiple Mennonite survivors who reached out to me and shared that they had experienced abortion or they had even witnessed or known of abortions?
I didn't know that, but it doesn't surprise me at all. I feel like in advocacy, we're in a space where if you stand up and say, "This is my experience," you automatically end up giving permission to hundreds, if not thousands, of others to go, "Oh, yeah." And like abortion is not my experience, but I have friends who have had abortions, and
Yeah.
I've had friends who are very staunch supporters of it, and friends who deeply regret it. And to all of them, I would say, those there's a grief that comes with abortion, no matter what your political stance on it is, and it just breaks my heart when someone says they've had an abortion and then they feel as if they're not allowed to grieve that loss. Like it is a loss, and if you went into that abortion thinking that this would never like not knowing how this came to this, especially if you were underage and it was forced on you, that is a deeply traumatic loss, and I'm so sorry.
Yeah. I just wondered if you were aware of that, um, regardless of where you stand. But would you like to hear the flip side of again why Mennonites aren't Amish?
Please.
Let me share with you. Like so I lived in 5 different Amish communities. Now the first one, when we moved out of that community, I couldn't tell you what their specific dating practices are. The second one, I witnessed and heard and observed bundling being practiced. They practice bundling. Do you know what bundling is?
What is bundling? It sounds like it's people bundling together.
So we didn't have like in all of the communities that I lived in, like we didn't have Rumspringa as the popular narrative exists. What we said is people went with the young folks. That's how it translates. That is correct. It is accurate to say people went with the young folks. So people would start going with the young folks in that community at approximately 16, 17 years of age.
Question. Going with the young folks, I understand it starts while they're underage. Does that include spending time with unmarried adults?
Sometimes you might get a 16-year-old who may be dating somebody that is, or going steady with somebody that is like 20 or 21 or 22, or, you might. You might also get a 16-year-old going steady with somebody that is 16. Yeah, I don't know. Um, but like our dating customs, were vastly different from what you described. And Rhoda, quite frankly, I am horrified that you had to get your ministry's approval and your like all of that. Like that's not how this works. Like
So that is not every church. That
right,
was,
true.
but plenty. And if even in churches where that is not an official part, if the ministry disagrees, they will have conversations with the dating couple and or parents involved.
Wow. Just wow. Like anyways, so what we had was more or less like so that was that community. So when I talk about going with the young folks, what I'm referring to is typically you would go on Sunday nights as you're going with the young folks. You would go to what we call the singing, and then after the singing, like the youth would um, let's just say this guy wanted to like date this girl, so he would send his friends, usually two of them, you know, gotta keep up appearances here, um to ask this girl, and they would take this girl aside and say, hey, can Jake take you home tonight? And the girl would say yes or no, and then like if she said yes, then like um he would go hitch up his horse. Like they would go back and tell the guy, and he would go hitch up his horse, and she'd go put on her like bonnet and outerwear garb that you're supposed to wear, whether it's summer or winter, whatever is appropriate. And he'd pull up and wait in his, as after he hitched up his horse, he'd pull up in his horse and buggy and sit there waiting for her to come out, and she'd go trot on out there and get into his buggy, and they go riding down the road to the girl's house. Okay, like that's one. Two, like the factors to consider when somebody asks you is like, oh well, do they come from a good family? Like your parents still can tell you like don't that he just doesn't come from a good family. Um, and then when they got to the house, so like here's where like the various practices came into play. So they would come into the house, like he would take her to her home. She would get out of the buggy, go into the house. Like in this community, the bundling. So she would come inside, go upstairs, go into her bedroom, put on her night dress, specially made for this occasion, and get into bed. He'd go unhitch the horse, put the horse away, and come into the house and climb, go upstairs and to her bedroom and climb into bed. That's called bundling.
So bundling is not just snuggling with somebody. I take it there's like this is
Well,
when
but
two
they're
guys.
not supposed to be untowards. They're not supposed to give in to the lusts of the flesh.
Okay, so I think the reason, I actually know the reason because it was explicitly stated why Mennonite practices are the way they are, is because of the number of ex Amish in the Mennonites who would say things like, they would refer to Amish dating practices as bed courtship. Is that a phrase that Amish even use?
We probably don't. I mean, possibly.
But they're
Beginnings,
basically.
beginnings, bet no, no. Okay, like we wouldn't the bundling in and of itself was originally its origins is literally because it was cold, it was practical to snuggle under the covers to keep warm. Okay, so as society evolved and changed, like society changed some things, like some people would put a board in the middle, other people would not. Regardless, like that was considered like a way to keep warm, right? But yes, bed courtship is also known as bundling.
Okay, so yeah, that explains then some of the extreme Mennonite rules because of the fear of this couple who's in love having sex or crossing any type of physical boundary. So like all of the don't hold hands, even sometimes in engagement pictures. Um, yeah, the like just keep miles apart. This is about marriage. This isn't about your body. This is about God's will. This isn't about your attraction. I think it's an overreaction to where some of the ex-Amish came from, um, that they imposed those rules. But so I can't get out of my head the picture of a 16-year-old in bed with a 21-year-old or a 22-year-old, and that just really it breaks my heart. Um, is there? Would you say that in that community there's a power dynamic attributed to age, to where, like, would a 16-year-old fully feel free to tell two guys no if they're asking on behalf of, say, a popular 21-year-old?
There is there's always outliers. There's always people who go against the grain, right? But by and large, I would say that women in that community specifically, and AFAB people in that community specifically, did not have the freedom to really say no. I know that some of them did, but they didn't really have the freedom to say no, if you get what I'm saying. It was
What
very much,
happens if she says no?
well, everybody's going to talk about it. Everybody's going to talk about it. Everybody's going to know about it. And if the community can apply enough pressure, they might like make them do this anyways. And like, I know that there's always outliers, right? There's always people who are a little different. I know a woman in that community who, like, oh lordy, she did not comply with like that kind of rules. Like, she never got married, but they also called her like an old maid, and the way they talked about her, and it was like she didn't really have like a voice, even though she fought back against that type of mentality, and she did within the community. um People also judged her for that very harshly. But the other part is that I also observed teenagers, sometimes underage, becoming impregnated and then having to marry that person. But we're not going to talk about that today. We just don't have to talk about that, huh?
So I'm aware of one situation in the Mennonites where we don't know for sure, but basically, the pregnant woman and the person who then became known as the mother, um, sequestered themselves from the community for a lengthy period of time, and so we don't know for sure who was actually the pregnant one. We don't know for sure that this other girl had the baby and then that the married woman took the baby on as her own. Um, do things like that ever happen in the Amish circles? Are you aware of teenage girls who are too young to get married, um, who have the baby and then the mom, either the girl's mom or some other lady in the community, basically acts as if she was the one who was pregnant and that's her baby?
Yes, actually, I know of a 14-year-old who, in fact, was impregnated by somebody where marriage was not possible. But I'm really uncomfortable talking about that because that's not my story. All I can tell you is that I observed it and I witnessed it and I heard about it and we all knew about it. It went through Amish communities like wildfire. It came out. We,
I am so sorry. I'm really heartbroken. Um,
like, I think
can you?
I think part of what you're seeing with like, and I just want to point on this just for a second, or part of what we see is that we have so many people who, quite frankly, um, they they leave the Amish communities and they go join the Mennonite churches, and they bring that Amish influence with them. Would you say that's correct?
I would say that there's probably some of that, but what I saw a lot more of was bringing an overreaction to Amish customs. So I remember one time we young people, I say young people, I mean teenagers, we were in school, not in the youth group. Hey, ask Judson to put on Tom and Jerry for you, love. Mommy can't right now. Thank you. Mama can hold you
Oh.
though. But we played a card game, and there was no alcohol. There was no drugs. There was no sex. It was just a card game, and we were playing card games on a regular basis to get through the muddy, ugly months of school, like January, February, March. And an elderly man at our church who was raised Amish really just did not appreciate that, and he's like he was raised Amish. He knows what card games are about, even if they're not connecting them to the other activities that sometimes come with card games like gambling or drugs or drinking. He doesn't want our young people even beginning to get close to that. And so what for us was just a happy pastime, like who can play Dutch Blitz the fastest, who can play Rook the fastest. um, that was outlawed because it was too Amish.
Yeah, that's so like in a way, like what you're describing is that because they came from the Amish, and what I'm hearing is that because they came from the Amish, and because often our experiences in life, they shape how we see the world and the lens within which we look at other people, and the lens within which we see like what is good and what is right, and what we see as being something to adhere to. They bring this to Mennonite communities, not necessarily in like a, okay, these values within the Amish, these are the values I had within the Amish church, so I'm going to bring them here. It's more or less like these are the Amish values, and because of how traumatic my Amish experience was, I can't stand any of that, any semblance of that. And so they reject anything that could even possibly be good. It's kind of like, that idea of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, which I still don't understand that saying, but I've been told that a few times. It's like, oh, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Well, if you read my book, you'll see exactly why y'all like just don't understand Amish culture. Like I just really want to put that out there. It's like, I write about the things that I experienced, but I also write about the things that kept me alive. And until I wrote my book, nobody in the world really wanted to actually share the things that kept me alive. That wasn't the thing. That wasn't the thing that media wants to hear. They just want to go and have this massive trauma dump. That's what they want. But when you talk about people who haven't dissected that trauma, they haven't worked through that trauma, and then they go into this other environment and they bring the effects, the aftermath of that trauma with them. And it sounds like, in a way, your Mennonite church, which is very different, right? But it was affected very negatively by that trauma.
I'm not sure if they would say that their Amish experiences were traumatic. I think the word they would use is sinful, and they were very very derogatory towards Amish. I I would have thought Amish were just like not good people from listening to them. And then when we moved to Pulaski, Tennessee, there was an Amish community close by, and they like the Amish women there were nothing like what I had in my head as a picture of an Amish woman. Like they were, I don't know. It was. I think there was a lot of overreaction going on. Hey, bud, you want a cinnamon roll? Yes. Can you wait 30 minutes? No, not really. Please, Mom. Not right now, my love.
Oh.
Please, Mom.
He needs a cinnamon roll. Well,
Well, he needs attention.
how long will it take you to go grab him a cinnamon roll?
Maybe a minute.
Go grab it. It'll be
All
okay.
right,
I'll just
I'm
talk
gonna go get you
to
cinnamon roll.
myself about like, the fact of like this is really really interesting. I think it's really interesting, and when Rhoda comes back, I'm going to ask her, like, so, like, how did all of this affect, like, her interactions, and did she find herself or ever catch herself being like, "Wait, what?" Because it almost sounded like Rhoda was going to be into like she said, Amish women were not what she expected according to what she was told by these people. Like, so like what like you've gotten to know me a little bit. So like was I what you expected according to these women? Or these people?
Um, no, no. There's this portrayal of Amish as being a little stupid or behind the times and really about having a lot of sex as teenagers in the youth group. And it's especially about the thing of having sex in courtship that is just not like there is no grace given, there is no understanding given. There's no like the fact that sex happens before marriage in the Amish, that is held as a reason to just get as far away from Amish culture as possible. That was my understanding of how the ex-Amish within the Mennonites viewed the Amish. And so as a teenager, then moving into a community that had Amish people around and spending time with them and getting to know them, it's like these women are running businesses, like bulk food stores. They are very involved in their father's businesses, behind the scenes, of course. They are intelligent. They are very happy. Like, that's my memory of being around Amish women. I'm not sure how much of the happiness like, I don't know. It probably varies from woman to woman, like what's genuine and what they needed to present to me because I was not Amish. Um, and I never saw any inappropriate behavior between young people when I was with them, but then I never also, like, I didn't go to Amish parties. So,
Yeah. Exactly. So, what you're saying is you were an outsider, and because of that, you're acknowledging that you probably saw exactly what they wanted you to see, which is true. But also, like some Amish women are happy, and like I'm a little terrified to ask this question, but again, like you've gotten to know me a little bit, you've gotten to know the kinds of things that I say, and I kind of want to know like how does it feel when I talk about Amish things versus like what you heard from the people within the Mennonite communities?
um, it just, how does it feel? I don't, I don't really assign an emotion to it so much as like I just go into processing mode and really trying to understand from your lived experiences as compared to what like the mental representation of Amish I was given and realizing that that mental representation is faulty and because this is exclusively because I was Mennonite around ex-Amish, that mental representation only comes from one place, and that is ex-Amish within the Mennonites. And so that is going to be a biased representation. So, yeah, it's a lot to unlearn. Um, and I'm trying to think if the ex-Amish in my life who were Mennonite gave us the type of information about like the abuses of power and the loss of voice that Amish women experience, um, or AFAB women, AFAB people. I don't think they did at all. It was definitely portrayed as if the sex that happens in courtship, if that is consensual, instead of it being a thing of, okay, sometimes, a 16-year-old with a 20-something-year-old, like, no, no. Um, I want to ask this too, but I realize that this is asking about your culture and your people, and if it's too invasive of a question, you're welcome to pass on it. Um, I'm aware of an ex-Amish couple where, like, she was his fifth partner, I think, um, because of like the courtship and breaking up practices in the Amish. There's an age there was an age difference between him and some of his other girlfriends. Um, but for her, I think he was her first or second. So in Amish culture, is there like a pass given to men that they can have however many partners before they get married? And if so, is that same pass given to the girl?
I mean, there is somewhat of a path, but like you will be talked about, regardless of whether you're a boy or like whether you're AMAB or AFAB. Like it doesn't matter. Like you're going to be talked about. If you've like broken up with like three girlfriends and you're going on your fourth one, they're going to talk about you. With yeah, there's going to be talk. But thank you for that analysis, Rhoda. I think like one of my big gripes has always been this is that like I was touching upon previously is that people don't want to hear that abuse doesn't always happen, that abusers go in cycles, that it's cycles of violence, and there's honeymoon phases, and there's other things. Like people didn't want to talk about those experiences. They wanted to hear about the trauma. And it almost sounds like from your lived experience within like with Amish turned Mennonites, that there was a lot of conversation about the sexual sins of the youth as teenagers, but there was no like discourse about the use of power, about the privilege of being born AMAB versus being born AFAB. Like, I don't think that Amish men should talk for women, period, because inside of our culture, they have sat there and they have for a long time. A lot of Amish men will literally speak over and speak for Amish women, or whatever voice that they have is given to them by the man in power of them, which is where, like, I do talk about my grandmother and how, like, I was told my whole life, I mean, my whole Amish life, that I'm just like her. And how, like, the thing is I had somebody reach out to me after they watched a video where I talked about like my grandmother. And the thing that they said is that everybody knew my grandmother and everybody knew my grandmother's voice. So I just want y'all to know that even the English people knew my grandmother had a voice. So there's always outliers. You cannot sit here and say that all Amish are like this or all Amish are like that. And furthermore, when you go into the dating practices, so that was one community. We haven't even gotten into the three other communities, actually, the four other communities I can tell you about because I dated somebody. I went steady with somebody from a different community. And in that community, so after, he drove me home, right? Well, because he was in a different community, we would go to his home and then he would go in the living room and sit on the chair and I was supposed to go sit in his lap. And in another community that I lived in, like their courtship practices, the youth were supposed to ride around in an open buggy so that, like, can't have any heavy petting. Okay. But
I forgot about that phrase. Yes.
heavy petting, right? No heavy petting. But then they were supposed to go and they were supposed to sit in the kitchen across from each other at the table with an oil lamp on. Okay. Like that's the story. That's what we're going with. And then in another community, they were supposed to go sit at the kitchen table again. Okay. But they didn't often have the light on. Don't worry, what happens in the dark stays in the dark. Unless there's
I'm just I'm just connecting some dots and tell me if I'm crazy here. So we know that what happens sometimes in Amish communities is actually traumatic. It's a trauma to be impregnated when you're underage by someone who you could not say no to without being gossiped about. And then to have to figure out how like what you're going to do with the pregnancy, abortion, forced abortion, your mom pretend that she's the pregnant one and you hide away, which that's isolation, and then you lose your child and basically watch someone else parent her. um, so if that's an actual trauma, and then these people leave the Amish community and come to the Mennonites, and they don't have mental health information. They don't have enough mental health information to say that what happened to me was a trauma. So they look at it as I sinned and got pregnant at 16, or I sinned and got a girl pregnant at 16. And so they are overreacting. They're having a trauma response, but they're calling it just another sin.
Uh-huh. That's exactly it, Rhoda. It is a trauma response.
Wow. Um,
Now, I will give this disclaimer is that Lancaster County Amish, they practice a whole different dating custom. I will not pretend to speak for them, but I will direct you to our February 14, like 2021 broadcast where we talk about Amish dating customs, and there were people present from Lancaster County. Regardless, like the point is that there are a large variety of dating practices within a variety of Amish communities, and each settlement practices different ways, pretty much somewhat to an extent, and they have different rules. And it's not just a sexual sin if somebody conceives out of wedlock. Sometimes it's also a crime. And when you don't have the language to describe what happened to you as a traumatic event, how do you talk about it without um, kind of demonizing the people the group that you came from?
yeah. And what you said there about not having a language, it reminds me of a poster I saw recently that was in English and Pennsylvania Dutch, and it was naming body parts, so that Pennsylvania Dutch speaking children could know their body parts and know how to speak to an English person. And when it came to the body parts like vagina, vulva, those private parts, there's only an English word. There's not an English and a
Because
Pennsylvania Dutch word.
because we don't have actual specific words for our private body parts in PA Dutch. That's why.
Does that come with it the sense of these parts are no more sacred or special than the rest of my body? Or does it come with a sense of shame connected to those parts? Or does it come with a sense of these are like so special, we're not even going to talk about them? What what is the general attitude towards private body parts?
I mean, I wouldn't speak for everybody, but for me, I felt ashamed of them. I know that I wasn't supposed to feel ashamed of them. They were the body parts that I was given by the good man, the good man, also code for God. Um, but I felt very ashamed of them. But I also think that based on our experiences is going to affect how we feel about those body parts.
Well, there's so much power in having open dialogues that are ongoing with your children. There's so much in that openness and transparency that just like we don't feel shame about things that we're comfortable talking about, and to literally not have words in your language for that, that in itself is a significant loss.
Yeah.
But it's the kind of loss that you don't understand as loss until you understand what could have been.
Well, and there's two language barriers. So we don't have the words for like the body parts, right? But you're also talking about like part of me wants to say like just stop, right? Like just stop doing this, right? But the other part of me also knows that like these people who came and joined your Mennonite church, like they had in an Amish education more than likely. And when you consider the type of education that they had, there's several ways that they experienced oppression that affected them, even in their ways of navigating their life inside of a different religion. And that could be like as simple as like they didn't have a framework from within which to begin discussing the trauma. They didn't have the ability to access resources to begin discussing the trauma. They didn't have the knowledge or access to information to allow them to process that this in fact was not okay, and that this was trauma, and that their feelings about it are valid. So because of that, it results in people who feel like we must kind of like they just there's there's a lack of ability to explain like what happened, and acknowledge all the parts of their life rather than only this part that was so traumatic that is overshadowing everything else. It's kind of like that thing that I talk about is like when you're in denial about your trauma, and you sit there and you put it in a box, you close that lid, it is locked tightly, and it still seeps out. There is no way that the trauma that you experience will not come out. And I almost see that as like that. Like the trauma came out despite their best attempts to prevent it from affecting their children, because for them, it was probably about protecting their children from what they experienced as Amish children.
Yeah, 100%. That actually helps me be a lot more compassionate to the people who were implementing rules that really frustrated my teen years, to view it as a thing of that they were coping with their trauma the best they knew.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, something that happened in the last couple weeks. I saw one of those like 30-second clips on Instagram, and I sent it to someone of Amish, like former, like someone with Amish ties, and it said if you grew up in a home with this, then you grew up with emotional abuse, and it listed five different ways of experiencing emotional abuse. Things like um, stop crying, I'll give you something to cry about, not talking about emotions, only allowing pleasant emotions, things like that. And I asked this person, how many of these did you experience in childhood? And this person said they experienced 5 out of 5. I'm sure that is not every Amish home, but when I think of that horrible comment or statement by the professor, who shall not be named, um,
Yeah, we're not going to go there. Let's not open that can of worms.
yeah, I don't know how widespread emotional neglect and emotional abuse is in the Amish, but that like if you are raised that emotions themselves are the problem, then it's going to be that much more difficult to admit that you have an emotional um, problem with the traumatic things that have happened. It's going to be that much more difficult to get the help you need. I see we're running out of time. I wanted to like, can I go on a little rant about how much it bothers me when people are like, well, people can all go through traumas, but some of them actually retain their faith, and so they kind of pit survivor against survivor when it comes to religious beliefs.
I mean, my platform is yours. Go ahead.
I really just want to tell people who are doing this to please stop. It is not helpful to anyone. It does not invite anyone into anything good. So if someone says, "Hey, um, other Mennonite women have gone through trauma and they stayed Mennonite and you haven't," it does not invite me into the warmth and goodness and community of the Mennonites. It invites me into comparison mode. It invites me into feeling less than. It invites me into needing to like try harder. It doesn't invite me into anything good. And I think that can be applied to whatever belief or faith you're trying to rebuke someone for not retaining. Um, as a general rule, comparison is just not good anyways. And when you mix comparison with faith, there are so many better ways. It's so much more healthy to only share your faith when you truly understand it for yourself and are excited about it. So there's a huge difference between saying um, you should be a Christian because Amish and Mennonite would profess to be Christians. You should be a Christian because that's the best religion there is, and you're doomed if you're not, and it's horrible. You're less than if you're not. And a difference in saying, hey, I've really, really gotten to understand why Jesus is incredible, and I just can't shut up about it. There's it there's something amiss when the best thing we have to offer someone else is come be better than that person.
Yeah. I would say this is I've actually known Amish people that didn't consider themselves Christians because Christians are of the world. Just so you know. So other Amish may consider themselves Christians, but some of them don't. Just a disclaimer.
That is good information for me. Like most of the Amish people I was around would have professed to be biblical or, you know.
Hmm. But regardless, I want to ask you a question at the risk of like opening a whole other can of worms before we go today.
Let's open cans of worms. Let's go for it.
Okay, so this is a good one. So when somebody tells you, don't pray for me non consensually, how do you respond?
I like that's your wish. Like I'm going to respect your wishes. Um, it's there's I'm sure you only came to that conclusion through a story that I have probably not heard. And so there's a part of me that is curious how that person came to that point. But also there's a thing of like when you add that non-consensually, it indicates that at some point you felt like prayers were being forced upon you in a way that made you less than or made you feel like you were less than. That is going to be my best guess. And so why would I add to that trauma?
So how would you feel if like people are promoting this idea that, well, I'm still going to pray for the person. I'm just not going to tell them that I'm praying for them.
Oh goodness. Okay, so my mouse is no longer mousing and it's annoying me. Um, I would have to sit with that one for a while.
Is that really
There's
honoring the request?
no, it's obviously not honoring the request. Um, there's the thing of I don't know. I'm gonna have to sit with that one for a bit because if someone like I've experienced the prayer thing both ways, where the prayers were authentic and genuine and done from a position of like a genuine position of I believe that I believe in a God who loves this person more than I do. But then there's one like I've 100% experienced like the condescending kind of prayers, and
The
that that feels kind of condescending to be
the whole
saying that.
well, you're speaking in a way that makes me uncomfortable. So this is typically what I've encountered often is that I speak in ways that makes people uncomfortable. And when I speak in ways that makes people uncomfortable, they love to pretend that I just need prayers and I just need forgiveness. And they love to tell themselves these stories because if they tell themselves these stories, it was explained to me by somebody, if as long as they tell themselves these stories, they don't have to see themselves in my story that I shared with them. And their way of saying, like, I'm going to pray for you anyways, is a boundary violation. Number one, I'm telling you that's a boundary violation. And if you can't honor my request to not pray for me non consensually, seriously, like I've experienced prayers that were genuine. I have. And those prayers are appreciated. But regardless, if I ask you not to pray for me non consensually, don't pray for me non consensually. That is a boundary violation. I've experienced people praying for me that my life is hard. Don't even. And then tell me about it. I've experienced so many things around prayers and non consensual prayers. Again, I don't think it's right to tell survivors, I'm going to pray for you as a catch-all phrase because it feels slightly dismissive and it feels like you're not really hearing the survivor. Like the prayer is supposed to take away everything that the survivor has experienced and is experiencing currently. And so now I'm on my soapbox, Rhoda. I know.
Stay on there. This is blowing my mind that people like it sounds like what you're describing is people are using prayer and assurances of prayer, and I'm going to pray anyways, as a power move.
It's like, let me
Like,
pat
that's
myself
not
on the
fair.
back. This will never happen to me or my loved ones because prayers, prayers. And I've done lots of things. I'm very supportive. I pray for you. It's the
Yeah, no. There's a scripture like if you are using the Bible as your basis for prayer, there's a scripture that directly rebukes this thing of praying that someone like if you see someone who lacks food and clothing and you say, "Oh, I'm going to pray for them to be fed and clothed," and then you go your way without feeding and clothing them, that prayer is pardon my language bullshit. So, same way with this, like if you have in your power, if you see that there's a survivor who is struggling emotionally, they're feeling isolated, they need justice, and you don't want to take on the burden of pursuing justice with them and pursuing justice for them, and instead you're just like, I prayed for you. I'm going to wash my hands. I mean, the very Bible that gives you the basis for prayer says no.
and there you have it. Thank you, Rhoda. Let me just thank you. No. Anyways, so please don't pray non consensual prayers for survivors. They have been weaponized against many of us. And, if we ask you for prayers, feel free. But if we don't ask you for prayers, don't. It is not helping anything. Regardless, if you're listening to this and you've experienced some of the things that maybe both of us have experienced, like what would you say to the people listening, Rhoda?
Just in general,
Hmm.
I would say healing is possible, living with hope is possible, um, learning new ways of thinking and doing and feeling and being is possible, and you are not a lesser person for being at an unpleasant place in your journey. So if you're looking at your life and you're going, I am so unhealed, I am so unwell, I have this bad habit, I have this bad thought pattern, I have this horrible way of relating, I'm emotionally stunted because of emotional abuse, and you are loved right where you are. Take a deep breath and um, live as if you're loved because you are.
Thank you. I would also say that I don't typically tend to talk about healing so much because for me, I consider it more or less like walking in the aftermath of trauma because it walking in the aftermath of trauma can be a lifelong journey. And the thing is if you can't understand how that makes sense, be grateful for the privilege that you have had in your life because you've never experienced something that is so gross and so terrifying and so horrible that it can stay with you. It can haunt your dreams at night. It can walk with you as you go about your life. It can sit with you as you sip a cup of coffee and get up with you in the mornings. There is no escape. It doesn't go away. It can become manageable. I promise you, if you have experienced trauma like that, I promise you it can become manageable. Your life can hold meaning and value and joy, and you can have happiness in your life despite all that. You can. There is a place for you. You are worthy of love and compassion, no matter where you are in life. And with that being said, I'd like to thank our Patreon subscribers for making this possible. I'd like to thank the Misfit Amish for helping fund this. And I'd like to thank Rhoda as always. Thank you for your candor, your openness. I appreciate it. And your compassion. Like it really means a lot to be able to have these conversations and to kind of like talk about some of the differences. And today's difference, like, woo! I hope y'all have a wonderful Saturday and we'll see y'all next time.